In Singapore, she spent hours below deck in the hot and crowded hospital ships, ensuring she spoke to as many of the 600 patients as possible. And at a leper hospital, she had no inhibitions about shaking hands, touching arms, and stroking foreheads. Allied troops had not yet reached Sumatra, but, guarded by ex-POWs with rifles and no ammunition, she flew there and toured the camps, as always, bringing comfort and hope. But one thing that does sadden me, I think, is that she seems to have this inexhaustible well of sympathy and care for strangers. And she will work her fingers to the bone, and she will talk to every single person in a hospital and talk to every nurse and every doctor and every patient. She'll stay up late. She'll get up early. She doesn't seem to run dry. And yet, this same care and concern, sympathy, and compassion that she has for these dying soldiers never seems like it was extended to her own children. Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is Cheer Denise, and today we're doing chapter 15 of the Mountbattens. And this is a chapter entitled Relief Work. So we're talking predominantly about Edwina and her continuing efforts in the war. But we're also talking about Dickie, and we're talking about how their relationship is really changing and growing. In the beginning of the book, their marriage was a train wreck. And it was a train wreck predominantly because Edwina kind of wanted to do her own thing. She had a ton of different men she was involved in. She was not invested in the family. She was not invested in the life that she had with Dickie. It just wasn't of interest to her. He, like a sycophant, kind of just panting after her, trying to gain her approval and her love, never seemed willing to really put his foot down according to how she was behaving. But then they sort of found their own way into something that works. So they both have very independent lives, but they have a great business relationship when it comes to their marriage. Both of them are very well connected. Both of them can help each other in the work that they have to do, particularly because Edwina is in relief services and nursing and Red Cross work, and Dickie's out there with soldiers whenever he needs something in the elements of morale or help with sorting things for them. He can call on Edwina, who has a massive network of aid, so that she can then assist him. So there's all this crossover between their works, and they're both like the king and queen of their arenas. So they're like the definition of the power couple. So while romantically, I wouldn't say that they aren't interested in each other romantically. It's just like that. If they had a priority list of who they would be running to for comfort, love, and intimacy, it wouldn't be each other. Nothing in the book has suggested that they are not intimate with each other or that they have sort of given that up and that they only have a work relationship. They seem to admire each other a lot. Always Dickie admiring Edwina. Seems like Edwina was all about the constructive criticism. So I think that she was kind of a extreme taskmistress. But I don't feel like he was turned off by that. I think he kind of liked the way she was very no nonsense and would say exactly what she thought he needed to do. I think that for a person like him, who was constantly enlivened by a challenge, being married to her was a challenge that he found interesting because she constantly called him to better. And I think that he liked that. So I wouldn't say that they had fallen out of love with each other. They have a great deal of respect for one another. And Edwina is constantly working in this chapter to continue to build his respect in her. He has some high praise for her at one point, which I was like, those would be nice words to hear from your spouse. They're not loving words, but they're words of deep respect. And so I think that there is definitely something to be said for that kind of admiration from your spouse. So we see their relationship continuing to grow in that arena, but we also see their relationship growing in the sense that they're becoming more comfortable with the extra members of their relationship, if you know what I'm saying. Like Edwina, of course, has always had a lot of affair partners. Dickie has, but almost like hang-dogged about his partners. Like he's not blatant and in Edwina's face about it the way Edwina was. Like Edwina dated people like she was trying to punish Dickie. And Dickie dates people because he's lonely. and then kind of seems like he felt ashamed about it. But now we're getting to a point where he wants to be open and honest and be as clear conscienced about his choice as she is. So we get a lot of that. So we see a shift in the way they're communicating about their affairs together. And we are going to be seeing a transition to Dickie's work because the war is coming to a close. So what's he supposed to do now? He's put in good work. We're going to talk about what were his contributions, what was he successful at, what did he fail at, and what were people's takeaways from him after the war was over and his job is beginning to come to a close. But the war's not over yet. So we begin the chapter with Edwina in the throes of relief work. It says, Edwina set off at the beginning of 1945 on a 3-month inspection tour, which would take in Cairo, Baghdad, and India. She was accompanied by Nancy Lees, the former assistant of Stella Underhill, and Major Brian Hunter from Dickie's staff. Hunter had ambitiously brought his golf clubs in the belief that there would be some downtime. He should have known Edwina better. After a long day inspecting medical and welfare establishments, the party would write thank you notes, compile reports of the day's activities, chase up issues that had arisen during the day, such as missing drugs or equipment, and even make new visits not already part of the program. Edwina met the heads of medical services, Lady Wavell, who ran the Red Cross, and various generals. No issue was too small to be addressed, from the right food for the patients with jaw injuries to army boots that chafed the feet of Indian and African troops. So she's exceedingly busy. I mean, she's not one of these people that drums up a lot of media support about what they're doing and constantly having stories leaked about how active she is. I mean, she is legitimately nose to the grindstone, driving herself as though she is in some kind of penance. And I really think, and as I've said this many times, the book has even suggested it as much, that the lifestyle that she had led for years of self-indulgence is a thing that it seems she is now trying to pay penance for. That this life that she had lived and this reputation she had gained as a frivolous person of little consequence is someone she's trying to eradicate from the public memory. And she's doing a really good job of it. The comedian and actress Joyce Grenfell, who joined her momentarily for some entertainment of the troops in India, remembered that Edwina Mountbatten was among us for 2 days, and I took my hat off to her. She looks chic and attractive and never stops working. Hospitals all day, Indian and British, meals in the messes with the sisters, and one night she came to number 17 officer's ward to watch us do our stuff, and the next night saw her at Boers dancing, where we all took the floor solidly for 3 hours. So she plays hard and she works hard. But she's just not known as somebody who shirks her duty or shirks the expectations that people have of her. She's constantly exceeding expectations. At the end of February, she embarked for the front, which gave her a thrill. Drove out to forward areas to within 500 yards of the Jap positions with stench and debris of yesterday's fighting. Live shells and booby traps still strewn around, she wrote. In China, she paid visits to hospitals, orphanages, the Institute of Health, a blood bank and a delousing station. She insisted on traveling third class on a leave train to see conditions for herself, traveling in the luggage rack. From there, it was Ceylon, where she saw convalescence depots, clubs, dental surgeries, hospital ships, inspected parades, and addressed the WRNs and the VADs and various hospitals and canteen workers. By mid-April, she was back in Britain, reporting to the Joint War Organization, lobbying the War Office, Ministry of Health, and India Office. She lunched with Churchill in an attempt to persuade him to send out more VADs and trained nurses, and saw the King and Queen. A month later, she left on a month's tour of Italy, Greece, and the Middle East, visiting sick and wounded troops. One of her biographers later wrote, "Nothing pleased her more than to be invited to a party. She would have one drink. If she could get her favorite rum and orange, she might have two. But she would talk to everybody and talk their heads off. If there was dancing, she would dance with every man at the party." She was an immediate success with the Americans in Burma. Entering wards in their hospitals, she would be greeted by wolf whistles. At Bama, she autographed the plaster cast on a GI's leg and caused a riot. So in some sense, it would seem that the need for thrills that she had when she was younger has not left her. She's just found a new way to receive the same brand of thrill. these men who will whistle at her when she walks in. I mean, why do you think that she always came in looking so put together? Remember, we read in earlier chapters that she had her uniforms especially made, tucked in at the waist, a little bit shorter in the skirt, higher heels than anybody else was wearing. Because she doesn't come in to be ignored. She comes in to be seen and to be recognized for what she's doing. So while I do think that there is a great deal of altruism involved in what she's doing, I think that there's also the desire to be seen by everybody as something new. So it's not enough that she herself knows that she's becoming something new. She needs other people to recognize it too. Because remember, this is a campaign to change her identity and to change her reputation. So I think that on the one hand, I'm glad that she's finding a different and more rewarding way to gain the same thrill. But at the very root of it, isn't it just another way to get men's attention? A little bit. But even if that's true, she managed to get real work done, and work done that other people couldn't manage to do, simply because she was so charming and because she was a woman. The book goes on to say that General Sir Philip Christensen, one of Mountbattens' generals, remembered how she flew over to Sumatra where she hobnobbed with some communist Republicans and visited refugee camps and gained much intelligence from the Japanese. Dickie was exceedingly angry at the risks she had taken and the political implications that might follow. But her brave actions could not have been done by a man. He would have been murdered on the spot. So, regardless of what some of her motivation may be, she's getting work done and getting work done better and more strategically than anybody else could do. Now, we're going to take just a brief moment to pause on the talk of her relief work to discuss the affairs that Dickie is having. From the last chapter, you remember that he has a new love affair going. It's with a woman named Janie. Now, back several chapters ago, his love was this woman named Yola, but when the war started, she kind of disappeared in France and no one had heard hide nor hair. Last chapter, Edwina did manage to find where Yola was living when she went to France for one thing or another, and they had a nice lunch together. So she's not dead, but she and Dickie don't seem to be in any kind of communication. He has a new girl now who is the love of his life, you guys, and her name is Janie. And that affair continued throughout 1945. Edwina was well aware of it, and did not mind. In March, she had arranged a lunch party for her husband, and included Janie and Teddy Haywood Lonsdale. And the following month, Teddy and Peter Murphy had given a small party with dancing, and Janie had been invited. As soon as Edwina returned to Britain, Mountbatten joined Janie for a weekend at her bungalow. Edwina seemed accepting of Janie. "I'm so glad that you felt as happy as I did about our newfound relationship," wrote Dickie. See, okay, I want to just pause real quick because Dickie's going to go on to talk to Edwina about this relationship that he has. But I find it strange that they need each other to be so approving and involved in the relationships that they have with other people. I mean, Edwina brought Bunny around all the time, and he became an actual legitimate member of the family. The girls, their daughters, loved Bunny. But the fact that Dickie needs Edwina to approve of this affair partner, what if she didn't? Is that going to stop him necessarily from doing it? I think, is it to soothe his conscience that she would not buck him at every opportunity about this? Because both of them are just going at it with all these other people, but that's heterodox enough. But then to need the other person to not only let it happen, but to heartily approve and like the other person. I mean, isn't that just a bridge too far to expect from other people? But he writes to her and says, "I've always wanted to have you as my principal confidant and friend. But as long as Bunny was yours, it made it literally impossible for me. I hope you didn't mind my mentioning about my girlfriends. It was only to show you that they never meant to me what Bunny means to you, and so can never come between us, providing that you no longer make difficulties about my seeing them within reason, as you were apt to do in the old days." There he goes again with that barb at the end every time. That's his way. We've discussed that. But I think his constant need to gain from Edwina this love and affection that seems will never be fully his just seems like an exercise in futility. I mean, just even what he's saying right here. "I always wanted to be your principal confidant, but as long as Bunny was hanging around, he was your favorite. Now that he's married and he's kind of out of the picture, as we read in the last chapter, Now I get a chance to finally gain the foothold in your heart that I always wanted. And you should know, by the way, that the girls I'm dating never held a candle to you the way Bunny seemed to hold a candle to me. But that's all over and done with. So now that you and Bunny aren't all hung up on each other, you should know I'm not getting all hung up on my girlfriends, okay? It's still you and me. You and me are still the one. But these girls are just people I'm hanging out with. And by the way, thank you so much for not pitching a big bitch fit about it, because you used to do that and it wasn't really fair since you were hanging out with Bunny. But I mean, just as long as you don't get crazy and catty about it, this should all work out fine. What is this talk? I mean, these people are just functioning on a different level, because I just don't know how I could emotionally take it if my husband was all the day long with all of these other women. And quite frankly, if I was all the day long with other men, like, how could your heart ever find any peace? Where would your heart rest when it's with this person or that person? And then, this affair situation is breaking down and that affair situation is breaking down. He's in emotional turmoil about his girlfriends, and you're in emotional turmoil about your boyfriends, and you're like trying to come together and then also have another thing with you, with the two of you. It's just like, where's the peace? I couldn't handle it. Okay, well, in May, Janie, after spending her last 2 days with Dickie, returned to Britain. She left him her Siamese cat, Sikri. "Your going has left a horrible hole in my life," he wrote to her in October. He said, "I have so many memories under every sort of condition, and they're very pleasant and happy. Sikri is a constant reminder of you, sweet and affectionate. When you left, she produced a load of kittens, and I kept one. I miss you more than I could have thought possible, my sweet and lovely Janie. Bless you and much love. Darling Dickie." Well, in the end, he's going to take up with YOLO anyway. When the war's over, he's going to scamper right back over to France and find his old French girlfriend. So I suppose he's not going to have to be too sad about Janie forever. The war's almost done. Back to it. On May 7th, 1945, Germany surrendered. But the war continued in the Far East. In March, Mandalay had been captured, and in May, Allied amphibious forces had entered Rangoon to discover the Japanese had already left. But Malaya, Singapore, Siam, Sumatra, and the Dutch Indies, Borneo, and Indochina remained under Japanese occupation. Now that landing craft, shipping, and aircraft were available, a huge amphibious operation, Operation Zipper, was being planned to recapture Malaya and Singapore. In July, Mountbatten was back in Britain as the Labour election win, forecast by Peter Murphy, was announced. Edwina was delighted. She was now more tolerant of Dickie's girlfriends. "The sweetest change," she wrote to her, "is the way you've conquered what we all thought was an unreasoning jealousy. You can feel easy in your mind that there is real safety in numbers, and that I won't be doing anything silly." I don't really know what that quote means. Sometimes we get quotes that just don't make any sense to me in the flow of what we just read. I mean, I understand that just a second ago we were talking about how the relationship is changing in reference to the way they tolerate each other's love affair partners. But I don't know what does this even mean? You can feel easy in your mind that there's real safety in numbers and that I won't do anything silly. I need more. What's the context here for that? Okay, well, it doesn't matter because we're about to talk about the atom bomb, so let's move on. Later that month, Mountbatten attended the last of the inter-Allied conferences at Potsdam en route to being reunited for the first time since the beginning of the war with Yola. At Potsdam, he met the new American president, Harry S. Truman. Roosevelt had unexpectedly died in April, and was let into the secret that the atomic bomb was about to be dropped on Japan. That's wild that they let him know that. Under what conditions was he let in on this information? I mean, of course, all the big American generals would have known. And as he was an Allied commander, I guess it makes sense that they would tell him. I guess I just feel like he's such a frivolous character so far. I know he's done real work. It just seems like I can't believe that they would let that information out to him, but maybe I just don't fully grasp how important he really was. On August 15th, 6 days after the second bomb was dropped, the Japanese surrendered. So Operation Zipper, which was what Dickie had been working on, was canceled. So I suppose it was important for him to know the atom bomb was about to be dropped, because all his work may be coming to naught. On September 5th, 1945, Allied forces retook Singapore. A week later, Mountbatten accepted the surrender of 680,879 Japanese men in Southeast Asia, insisting that senior commanders hand over their swords in a public loss of face. He described the event in his diary as the greatest day of his life. I'm sure it was. I mean, that was what he'd been working for years now. And to be able to head that surrender would have been exhilarating. But the book wants to discuss what exactly was his record when it comes to him as a commander. His instructions had been to wage war with landings by sea, but none of that took place. His efforts were constantly rebuffed or frustrated, and he was frequently denied requested troops and supplies because of demands in other theaters of war, or because the Americans wanted to minimize the British influence in the region. Mountbatten did not handle his generals well, but then many were difficult and temperamental, suspicious of a man much younger and hitherto more junior to them. The demotion of General William Slim as commander of the 14th Army by Oliver Leese, the commander Allied Land Forces Southeast Asia, and the subsequent replacement of Leese by Slim on Sir Alan Brooke's orders was an embarrassment, showing the weakness of his authority. Personality differences between Mountbatten and Joe Stilwell, Mountbatten and James Somerville, the breakdown of the relationship between Chikanchek and Stilwell, and differing views over wartime goals and post-war plans made SEAC less effective than it might have been. The British wanted to restore the British Empire with self-determination to follow, whilst the United States' focus was on China. The fact that most of the money and resources came from America meant their objectives, especially the emphasis on the Burma Road supply line to China, took precedence. So did he have any achievements? Because that's sort of a grim picture we've painted. Well, the improvement in morale, which contributed to the new military success, was a credit to him. Though Slim and other generals should take credit for the victories from 1944, it was Mountbatten who created the framework and support that allowed them. Success at Arakan and Impal was in large part due to his persuading the Americans to release aircraft from their trips over the hump to China to bring in extra troops and supplies. Perhaps most importantly, and in difficult circumstances, Mountbatten largely kept the various competing factions in check. Henry Pownall wrote a shrewd analysis of his strengths and weaknesses. He said, "One of his best points is his way with troops. That is quite admirable. He looks the part, he says the right things, and he's the king's cousin. At heart, the troops are snobby to that extent. He has plenty of moral courage, yet not enough to allow him to face calmly an unpleasant interview. He is too fond of quarrel by proxy. For he hates a row and he wishes to be popular and well thought of, and is indeed almost pathetically surprised when he learns that there are people who do not care for him and his ways. His strongest point is his resilience. With all his natural advantages and the experience he is now getting, he will surely play a big part in the post-war empire, and he is qualified to do so." I do think that that was probably his greatest mistake, is the bit where he needed everyone to like him. And he needed to believe that everyone liked him. I'm sure there was a lot of drama created by him instilling in other people his disdain for someone else and then having them go and bear his wrath rather than him just come up and say to the person, "I don't like that you did X, Y, and Z," call them out to their face. So I think that there would have been a lot of drama. And it has been alluded in other chapters before, too, that he did create a consistent issue with drama. And constantly was a bit of a pot stir. And I think maybe this is what they mean by that. I didn't quite know what that meant then. But this business about how he's too fond of quarrel by proxy sounds exactly like what the author was alluding to earlier by saying he was a bit dramatic. Well, the war's over, so what's his responsibility going to be now? Because he's got to do something and he has all this experience. How are they going to use it? How are they going to use the investment that they have placed in Mountbatten and make good on the experiences that they've allowed him to have? Remember, he wasn't even supposed to be in that position that he got. It turned out to be divine that they placed him at the head of SEAC, but he wasn't anybody's first choice. So they've given him this opportunity. He's done the best with it that he could. What now? Mountbatten's command with the end of the war was now extended to include French Indochina, Java, Borneo, and the Celebes Sea, adding another 500,000 square miles to the million square miles for which he was already responsible. There were 125,000 Allied prisoners of war and civil internees to be rescued, as well as 750,000 Japanese to be sent back to their country. Apart from the devastation of war, civil administration had broken down, and the resulting power vacuum was being filled with a variety of nationalistic groups. His post-surrender tasks were to restore the rule of law, regenerate the economy, and either restore old governments or open the way to fresh elections. Ugh. What a nightmare. Can you imagine? That list is ridiculously hard. establish rule of law, regenerate the economy, and restore old governments or open up fresh elections, I would rather be shot in the head. That seems like an impossible task, especially when you're faced with these nationalistic groups who have more fight in them than, say, a regular political structure in which people are elected and all this. These are people who want to dig in and fight. Their country has been at war. Their home has been ravaged. The world that they know is over. They're not going to come in and just let some British guy tell them how their government is now going to be structured. We're going to see that play out in Vietnam when the Viet Cong show up. The book goes on to say that a complication was reconciling the interests of the former colonial powers, the indigenous movements, and the United States, who was now an important regional player. Mountbattens going to have a problem because he can predict that this is not going to be where we just return to the status quo. So he's going to be in talks and arrangements with some of these nationalistic groups where some people are going to call him disloyal to the cause of the British Empire and think that he's too left-leaning in his politics and that he has too much of a bleeding heart for some of their concerns. There could have been some truth to that, but I also think that the reality is a major world war has just ended. We can't just be like, all right, that was fun. Let's take our troops and go home when everything will go back to the way it was. How could it? And I think that he realized that he had to work within this new framework that he sees coming up. Like, he's got to learn how to work with these people. He can't just plow over them and expect things to peacefully return to normal. Mountbatten's response to the situation was pragmatic. He did not have the resources to put down these nationalistic uprisings, so he had to work with them. It might not be popular with some of the old guard, but he recognized that the popular aspirations released by the war could not be cast aside. Some thought him too inclined to the left, too ready to listen to upstart leaders in the emergent liberation forces. It would be fair, I think, to say that he recognized more quickly than many of the old status quo that it could never be restored. An example of this is that in Burma, where he worked with Major General Aung San, leader of the Burma Independence Army, which had been set up and controlled by the Japanese, Mountbatten's aim was to postpone the reimposition of indefinite direct rule in favor of an independent Burma within the British Commonwealth, but his plans were thwarted by the British cabinet, and when the pre-war governor, Sir Reginald Dorman Smith, was reinstated. In Malaya and Singapore, ethnic conflicts together with communist influence created an even more difficult situation. Here, Mountbatten kept civil order while still again promoting moves towards independence within the Commonwealth, until in the spring of 1946, Malcolm MacDonald took over the Governor-General of the two countries. Siam, now Thailand, continued as an independent country, but the problems of Indochina proved more intractable. Mountbatten controlled the country south of the 16th parallel, with Chiang Kai-shek in charge above. Before the French could restore their colonial empire, Ho Chi Minh and his Viet Minh movement declared the Independent Republic of Vietnam. Attempts by Mountbatten to persuade the French to come to terms with the Viet Minh were rejected, and he was relieved shortly afterwards to surrender responsibility for the area. So, while Dickie's having a real problem with the whole political faction situation in the area that he's supposed to completely revigorate and inject life into after a war, he's got this other issue of the POWs and the internees. And so he's in charge of getting people relocated to where they're supposed to be. And this was work that he and Edwina could do together. The exact location of the POWs and internees had to be established, together with numbers and the extent of their needs, and arrangements had to be made for medical staff, supplies, and transport. Siam, still regarded by the generals as too dangerous to visit, was Edwina's first stop. At one hospital camp, where almost 20,000 prisoners had died in 1942 and 1943, she found thousands of men suffering from TB, malnutrition, gangrene, and dysentery. Climbing onto a wooden platform which served as a communal bed, to rousing cheers, she gave them words of comfort. She was always direct. She told one group of prisoners that they smelled. But, for all that, she was modest, good-natured, and sympathetic, and she immediately tried to improve their quality of life in all sorts of practical ways. Very practical, because she said that relief packages needed to contain things like condoms. And she asked for magazines, books, playing cards, and toys for the children. In Singapore, she spent hours below deck in the hot and crowded hospital ships, ensuring she spoke to as many of the 600 patients as possible. And at a leper hospital, she had no inhibitions about shaking hands, touching arms, and stroking foreheads. Allied troops had not yet reached Sumatra, but, guarded by ex-POWs with rifles and no ammunition, she flew there and toured the camps, as always, bringing comfort and hope. I am so inspired by the change that is in her nature. But one thing that does sadden me, I think, is that she seems to have this inexhaustible well of sympathy and care for strangers. And she will work her fingers to the bone, and she will talk to every single person in a hospital and talk to every nurse and every doctor and every patient. She'll stay up late. She'll get up early. She doesn't seem to run dry. And yet, this same care and concern, sympathy, and compassion that she has for these dying soldiers never seems like it was extended to her own children. And I wonder what it is sometimes with people who are so exceptionally able to give of themselves for hours, but who can't seem to give to their own immediate family. I don't guess it's that big of a mystery. I mean, I suppose one could just as easily say, because there's no glory in giving to your own family. No immediate glory. Nobody's writing any articles about you when you clean the house and, cook 3 meals a day and do a load of dishes and discipline accordingly and, sit down and teach your kids to read and all of this. I mean, there's no glory in that kind of sacrifice. No one's going to be noticing your high heels and your snatched waist at home. And so I think possibly it's always easier to give outside your home than it is to give in your home. But it does show that she was of the character to do this sort of thing. So it makes me sad for her family. Like, I think if I was one of her daughters, it would be a bittersweet thing to see in the news what my mother was up to. Because I think, how can she give so much care to them? But she's missed my whole childhood. Because her children are not little anymore. They're half grown, if not grown. And so to see your mother doing all this, but then she's so cold to you at home and you always feel this distance between you and her. But she can go to a leper colony and lay hands on the leper's head and show all this kindness and concern. And she's not worried about the lepers. Well, that's good. I'm glad she's not worried about the lepers. But what about your own kids? That you could let them go to bed night after night after night, never lay your hand on their forehead to bless them before they go to bed. Are we doing all that we can do for the people in our life? I guess I read that and I like there was a prick of conviction in my heart because I thought, do I? And of course I do. We all do. But we all prioritize people outside our homes more than we prioritize the people in our homes. That's why the people in our homes sometimes get the worst of us. Everyone always says like, oh, the people you're close to, that's the people that get the worst from you, which is sort of true. I think we're all like that because we know those people still love us. But that's not good enough for us to acknowledge it but not change. And I read this and I thought, am I doing this? Where in my life am I accidentally, or maybe even purposefully, because how accidental can it be? Where in my life am I choosing to prioritize the feelings of strangers over the feelings of the people in my home? And where am I willing to give of myself because it'll be noticed? And where I wouldn't give the same effort at home because no one notices? And I suppose I just read this and I thought, I don't want my kids ever to look on and think, boy, she sure had a lot to give for them. To continue on, Edwina and Dickie just make a great couple, and everyone sees it. Like I said at the beginning of the episode, they are the power couple. One of those accompanying them was Tom Dribberg, a Labour member of Parliament who, on the recommendation of Frank Owen, had come out to write a few articles for Reynolds News, and then he'd been taken on to a temporary advisor. He remembered a formal dinner at Government House with 40 senior officers in their white mess dress, when Mountbatten had also included 4 recently repatriated prisoners from Chegai Jail, all still in their shabby prison garb. They were the guests of honor, and Mountbatten ensured at the end of the evening that they were driven back to their camp. This incident, I thought, showed the best side of Mountbatten's character. His lack of pomposity, his curiosity about people, his keen sense of the effective gesture, perhaps of public relations. I found him and his wife an unusual and interesting couple. Both were extremely good at their jobs, so much so that there was almost a kind of competition between them. At breakfast, they would compare the total numbers of British prisoners in the camps whom each of them had spoken to and shaken hands with. All right, I just want to pause real quick here because maybe it's just the cynic in me, and I'm sorry. I know, it's something I need to overcome. I read this and I think, Mountbatten, how dare you invite 4 people to come and dine with 40 senior officers, all in their white mess dress, and these 4 prisoners are still in their shabby prison garb. Is it beyond you to provide them with clothing appropriate to the occasion so that they don't have to stand out in this place that's elegant and refined, and here they are with the garb of their old life still draped over their shoulders? I mean, it seems to me that the lack of care in that element of the evening does not speak well to Mountbatten. And I'm trying to figure out, is this reporter who wrote this, is he the poor judge of character, or am I? Like, I read this and I think, well, isn't that such a signal for the group there that Mountbatten, look at who I am, says Mountbatten as he parades his 4 prisoners in front of everybody in their old clothes. This is the sort of person I am. Look, I've rescued these people. Let's all take note of who I am and what I'm doing and the business that I'm about. It just sort of seems that he's using them to advertise what a savior he is. And I'm not saying that I'm sure they were pleased to eat a delicious dinner and pleased to sit amongst people who cared about their situation. I'm not saying those 4 prisoners gained nothing from the evening. I'm just saying that to give them, to not even think about how they would feel and their comfort in that situation. I'm telling you right now, if I just got out of a prison camp, Lord knows when was the last time I bathed, I'm still in my shabby, threadbare clothes, and I'm sitting there at a dinner, which already would be a jarring situation because it would be so different from what I've already experienced for years, possibly. And then to not even be able to blend in to the society, but to be the glaring object of everybody's attention, I think it would be overwhelming. And I don't know why he didn't take the care to make sure that while they were still the guests of honor, they could at least be comfortable while being so. Anyway, at the end of November, Edwina returned to London. She had made a huge difference, and her husband was incredibly proud of her. Now listen to these high words of praise. He wrote to her and said, "If you weren't my wife, I'd offer you permanent employment in a very high rank on my staff. And I know of no other woman I'd say that to." Ooh, nice. Can you imagine? Those would be huge words, especially because she has worked so hard to gain his favor and respect. Because while I think he wanted her to notice him, I don't think he always respected her. And how could he? I mean, the life that she was leading was not a respectable life. In the New Year's honor list, she was awarded a DCVO on the recommendation of the King and Queen. She could now look Dickie in the eye. And that's what she's been after this whole time, so well deserved to her. We are now going to read a passage in which we see the vulgarity of Mountbatten's complete entitlement and how ungrateful he could be. So she's getting awards for her service. Awards are going to be meted out to him as well, but not good enough for him. Okay, he's unenthusiastic about what they're offering him. Mountbatten was himself offered a barony in the New Year's honors list, which gave him a seat in the House of Lords. For most people, this would have been an offer that they could not refuse. But Dickie, already of higher precedence as a son of a marquess, was playing for larger stakes. Both Alexander and Montgomery had been made viscounts, and he saw no reason why he should not be awarded one as well. Indeed, he argued disingenuously, it was simply downgrading his particular theater of war. He was also worried that accepting a barony would make the subsequent offer of a viscountcy more difficult. In any case, he pointed out he would much prefer the Garter or Order of Merit. Are you allowed to just come up and be like, I don't like these awards. I don't want this peerage. I'd rather have X, Y, and Z. I mean, it just seems a little bit like you just take what they hand you. Isn't that the way that's done? I don't know. How would I know? I've never received any awards or peerage, but it just seems like if somebody's offering you something, do you shove that aside and be like, no, I'll take that one over there. Edwina was dispatched to bend George VI's ear. I have most decided views, which I would prefer her to discuss with you verbally if you can spare the time to see her, Dickie wrote to him. Personally, I don't want a peerage, and above all would hate to lose the Louis from my name. Another argument was that he did not feel that he could accept in honor while my men are still losing their lives in French Indochina and the Netherlands East Indies. I fear my job is by no means completed. Well, he does make a good point there. The job's not done, so let's not award him for work that hasn't happened. But the king's private secretary, Tommy Lascelles, was infuriated by Mountbatten's somewhat film-starish attitude towards his proposed barony. Meanwhile, Edwina was again deployed to make Dicky's case to the king, briefed by Peter Murphy. In the end, Dicky was offered a viscountcy, and took it in the national interest, subject to minor conditions such as continuing to call himself Lord Louis Mountbatten. Dicky continues to show that he is as shrewd as ever, and we are going to swing things over to the introduction of this character named Jawaharlal Nehru. He's going to become of enormous interest to Edwina. But this is where we're introduced to him, and not in that context just yet. We'll get to it. But in mid-March 1946, Jawaharlal Nehru, as a leading member of the Indian National Congress, was invited to Singapore to meet Indian troops and study the conditions of the large Indian community in Malaya. The British authorities, nervous that he was out to cause trouble, did not feel he should be officially received nor allowed to meet Indian troops. But this is where Mountbatten shows his cunning and his wisdom, because he recognized that he might well be India's first prime minister, and if he was not treated well, the British actions would only further ferment anti-British feeling. He insisted that he would meet him at the airport and accompany him into town in his open-topped limo to the St. John Ambulance Indian Welfare Center, where Edwina would be waiting. What could have been a public relations disaster was turning into a celebration of Anglo-Indian friendship. How nice. But then we get this very odd incident that I can barely wrap my head around. It sounds like a scene from a Three Stooges sketch. All was going well until Nehru's arrival at the center. The delighted crowd rushed him, knocking Edwina over in the process. Jayanto Chowdhury, a brigadier on Mountbatten's staff, tried to help. So he writes and he says that he was trying to be chivalrous and he bent down to help her up and he said, "Lady Mountbatten, can I help you up? Let me give you a hand getting up." And she said, "Don't be a mug. This is a friendly crowd. If you start giving me a hand, they'll all be giving me a helping hand, and they'll pull all my clothes off my back, and I might tell you that in this heat, I have very little on." How is that a response to somebody being like, "Can I help you up?" And you're like, people start tearing my clothes off, and I have hardly anything on. Is the heat getting to her head? Mountbatten and Nehru linked arms and charged the crowd to rescue Edwina, who had crawled between the people's legs and had come out at the far end of the room, got up on a table, and shouted out to us that she was all right. It had been an unusual introduction to what became a crucial relationship. That night the Mountbattens and Nehru dined together. We talked about everything under the sun, Mountbatten later remembered, and that is where our friendship started. Mountbatten's time at SCAC had now come to an end. From Singapore, the couple flew to Australia, where Dicky had meetings with the Australian Chiefs of Staff to discuss the handover to Australian garrisons and SCAC. When Dicky had last visited 25 years earlier, it had been as an aide to the Prince of Wales. Now he and Edwina were the star attractions, with cheering crowds and civic receptions and countless speeches. Dicky had always enjoyed this sort of attention, and Edwina now found that she did too. They are becoming addicted to the praise and the adulation. But this is my concern. What do they mean Edwina now found she did too? We've always known that Edwina loved attention. This is no revelation. What, though, are they supposed to do? The war's over. So people are throwing around different ideas for Dicky now that he's no longer in charge of the SEAC. Should he be the Governor General of Australia? Maybe he could be the Chief of Staff and the Minister of Defense. Maybe the Viceroy of India. But Dicky's ambitions were not for any of those governing jobs. He told Edwina, "I really want to go back to the Navy, as you know, and I don't like the idea of governing. But if it ever became unavoidable, I know that you would make the world's ideal viceroy." That's the end of that. Next chapter is called Love and Marriage. I don't know exactly what that's supposed to look like. I mean, it's with these two. With anybody else you could imagine, but what will love and marriage look like for Dicky and Edwina in the next bit? Anytime I do a chapter on the Mountbattens, it will be in the playlist for the Mountbattens. So you can just look there and then you can see if there's any new episodes you haven't listened to. All right, well, I always ramble at the end of these things, so I'll let y'all go. We're going hiking this morning, so I got to see to that. But I'll see you guys later. Bye.